It's Birdman for Wheelchairs for Warriors, and today we're just kicking off with all the introduction of the people that make it happen, and of course, one of the two women that made it all happen, I've got with me now. It's Heidi HANSING. How are you?
Hey, Rob, I couldn't be better.
Cool. So we were back and forth a little bit. You actually had a relative that had a baby, so that's awesome.
Yes, thank you very much.
So let's talk a little bit about the beginnings of Wheelchairs for Warriors. And,
Okay.
For you, and I know we've had this conversation before, but just for the listeners and the people who are going to start into this, where did it all start?
Well, I'm a veteran myself, and I've been involved in veterans issues ever since a couple of years after I got out of the military in the 90s. And I kind of stayed in the realm of activism and lobbying on behalf of veterans issues for many years. And that's kind of what got me into politics in the first place, was veterans issues and wanting my voice to be heard, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, then we got into the war in the early 2000s, 2003 and 4, and I was very active in covering that from basically a war blogger angle.
Okay.
And that kind of kept me within that realm. And then eventually I was elected to office. And that was where I felt like I really had to reconsider who I believed my demographic was. Like what were the kinds of people I wanted to surround myself with? I can tell you, Rob, it's not politicians. It was not. And I was kind of at a crossroads. And that was where, and Crystal and I kind of met at the same crossroad at the same time. I was looking to get out of politics and wanted to leave that behind. And I really felt like my quote unquote demographic, if you will, the people that I wanted to spend time with, the people that I wanted to represent, and the people that I wanted to serve were veterans. Those are my people. And that was where I wanted to continue service, because it's really not in my nature to just go and work for the man somewhere, right?
Right.
There has to be purpose behind it. There has to be almost like, I don't know, ministry behind it, if that's an appropriate word to use. And so Crystal and I, that's where it started for me. And Crystal and I kind of met at those crossroads. She had gotten there via a different route, but to the same crossroads. And we started to really look around and see where's the need? What need can we fill?
Right.
What service can we render? What will actually change lives, where that, like, tangibly, like we could see the difference. The before and the after had to be tangible. It had to be apparent to us.
Right.
And that's kind of a long way around to where we got when we decided, we saw the need. We saw it in our face every single time we went to a military function.
Yeah.
And we saw veterans struggling to use the equipment that they were issued, just like they do when they're in the service. You make do with what you're given. And that was where the light bulb really went on for us. And we thought, this can be done better. It can be done with full transparency and accountability. And we were at the time kind of disillusioned with some of the big name veterans organizations and outfits that were misappropriating funds.
Yeah.
And we were like, let's do this the right way. And
So,
that was where the vision started.
just to touch on that a little bit, there are thousands, maybe tens of thousands of veterans support groups and nonprofits. And, to me, when I look, you want to support veterans. Personally, I like to support individual veterans in their efforts. Like down the street from me, there's a coffee shop that's veteran owned. Okay. So I support that because it's a veteran that does that, and that's how somebody can support directly. And he does things that benefit local veterans. Then you've got like, maybe state organizations, and you get some larger things like a VFW and things like that. And those are more support organizations that provide services for veterans. But as I come into the scope of things and looked at all the organizations that are out there, national organizations, there's not many. I mean, you can put money into them, but you don't really feel like you don't ever get to see what it goes out to. And then they're like, oh, we help thousands of veterans. And it's like, but how do you help thousands of veterans? Whereas with Wheelchairs for Warriors, it's you don't help thousands of veterans. Okay. You help. And I don't know how many wheelchairs you've given out to date. Do you know that?
Yeah, we just crossed the 80 threshold in 6 years.
So it's not, but that's 80 direct, like who the person is, impact. Okay, and these
and it's not just them; it's their families as well,
right? And
their communities.
You got it. And you can, it's tangible. Like I know, that wheelchair, which costs this much, was given to that person. So boom.
Yes. And you see, and you hear in their own words, how it changes their lives.
Right.
I can tell you this, we did not even realize when we first started how expansive this program, how many areas of life, we just didn't have a full picture yet.
Right.
So, and maybe if we had, Rob, maybe if we knew then what we know now, it may have seemed like too big of an elephant to eat,
But you didn't eat it all at once. You took bite by bite, and here you are.
We did. And it was the serious on-the-job training.
Right.
But one of the things that we realized is that we're not just dealing with the mechanics of providing a wheelchair. It sounds mundane to some. It's not as flashy as other programs. Certainly heartwarming, but a lot, changing somebody's daily mobility for the better is kind of mundane, right? But we realized we're not just in the business of wheelchairs. We realized that limited mobility impacts so many other areas of life. It impacts their relationships. It impacts their ability to interact with their communities, like in their children's schools or in church or in public spaces, common areas. They just don't go anymore. It's just too difficult. It's too cumbersome. We also realize that it impacts their relationships because these are men and women of action, and they can no longer do things for themselves that we all take for granted. And it makes them feel like a burden. It makes them feel like they are purposeless, and they get very frustrated. And that then is kind of projected onto their caregivers, and they hate being a burden to their caregivers. And it's kind of this, it becomes this snowball effect where we're like, oh, now it's impacting people's relationships. It's impacting their mental health. We know that people nowadays, after a couple years of enforced, restricted, and limited mobility, people being trapped in their houses, quarantined for weeks or months, at a time.
Yeah.
I think people have a more empathetic view of how mental health is degraded when people are isolated.
Indeed.
And so now we find, okay, well, now we're into mental health. Now we're into marriages in crisis. Now we're into, not just physical mobility, but all of the things and all of the areas of life that impacts. And so here we are 6.5 years later.
But you're addressing trauma at its functional level. Literally, the functional effect of trauma. And one of the things that really got me was, I think you don't know until you know, right? I remember you introducing me to one of the recipients, and he was a gentleman that was in prosthetics. And I'm like, in my mind, I'm going, well, why does that guy with prosthetics that can walk around need a wheelchair? I'm like, that
Right.
doesn't, like, you don't know. So you're like, well, why would they need a wheelchair? And it's like, well, yeah, you're walking around prosthetics, you basically rub the nub off and you start to deteriorate it and make it smaller. And I'm like, yeah.
Yeah.
So the least amount of time you want to be on your prosthetic, the better, because then you have better quality of life longer.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. In fact, he'd had multiple amputations. I know exactly who you're talking about because I remember that was when we introduced him to you.
Yeah.
And his doctor had said, this is it. This is the last amputation you get. If it becomes infected and it wears away anymore, not only will he lose more of his leg, like up to his hip joint,
Right.
but at that point he would have nothing left to attach any prosthetics to. So then he wouldn't even have his prosthetics. And if you remember, he was very athletic.
Yes.
He had prosthetics for everything. He had prosthetics for walking.
Uh-huh.
He had prosthetics for jogging and running and boxing because he was our Golden Gloves boxer.
Yep.
And so now he's threatened with not only will he be permanently assigned to a wheelchair, but now he won't even be able to attach a prosthetic any longer. That is what galvanized him to action.
Wow.
And the VA wouldn't give him a wheelchair.
Nope. Because not necessary. Because you're walking around.
No,
you're walking around. Yeah, you're walking around. Why do you need a wheelchair?
Dude, you've got half a dozen prosthetics. You've got half a dozen prosthetics, so you don't need a wheelchair.
I equate it to sitting there watching your house, and the beach is eroding away from underneath it, and it's going to fall at some point. So, and somebody goes,
Yes.
"Well, you got a house. You don't need any structural support.
Right.
Go away."
Yes, and we got him a real zippy ultralight wheelchair that he could travel with that would get him off of his prosthetics. He
Right.
needed to rest his leg,
Right.
get off the prosthetics, scoot around in his apartment, and then not be on it so much that it was causing more erosion of his nub and more infection. So
Okay.
very, very much a success story.
So that's your story for Wheelchairs for Warriors. We're going to come back and talk to you at some point in time about traveling around the United States, traveling around everywhere else, who you meet with and things like that. But wanted to get the base, that sort of beginning of where the passion started. So thank you very much for that.
Well, yes, and thank you for listening. It's interesting to go back to the beginning because you're like, yeah, how did we get this far down the road? And you look all the way back and you're like, yes, that's right. It's always about my people. These are my folks, Rob. These are the guys and gals that I will do anything for. And I know Crystal would say the same thing. One of our slogans is we serve those who served us. And that's the mantra we live by.
Very good. Once again, Heidi HANSING with Wheelchairs for Warriors.
Thank you, Rob.